Hey everybody, welcome back to another video in our Intro to Music Tech series. In this video we're going to talk about digital audio workstations and get a basic overview of some of the things we're going to see in the DAWs that we will work with in this semester. So we want to think about digital audio workstations as the primary environment where we're going to record, edit, and process digital audio as well as MIDI data. Now, the underlying technology for DAWs really came from two different convergent technologies, or rather the conflux of two different technologies that were very prominent in the 1980s and 90s. So these were recording systems based on tape machines and mixing consoles, what we call the tape and mixing console paradigm, as well as something called MIDI sequencers. Now, when we think about recording studios, a good way to think about this can be seen in the image that we see on the screen now. This is UMass Lowell's Control Room A. This is room 213. This is our 48-channel API Vision console. We can see a very large format console here. And we see a tape machine up over here. This is actually an older tape machine. This isn't the one that's there anymore. In this case, this was an older Otari machine that has been replaced. We see here on the right side a bunch of racks with a lot of outboard gear. This studio, of course, does use Pro Tools, so we do have a DAW over here. But right now, for the purposes of this discussion, we're really thinking about this mixing console, this tape machine, and the processors back over here. And we can see in the next slide here another view of the console. We can really get a sense of how many different knobs are on this console. Now, in this recording paradigm, generally speaking, we ran signal into the console where it went through an input stage that would include potentially microphone preamplifiers or other line amplifiers to bring our signal to a level appropriate to send to the tape machine, where it would then be recorded on tape. Then during playback, the signal from the tape would be brought back into the console and mixed by utilizing various faders here to change the levels, various equalizers and other signal processors, both those built into the console here, as well as the ability to route through various types of interconnects to the gear on this side of the room. We call those aux sends or inserts, and we'll see that is terminology that will carry through into the DAW environment. Here we can see our Otari 827 2-inch 24-track tape. We can see the various meters for the various tracks up here. We would load tape onto the various supply and take-up reels, and they would play here across the head stack here that would both erase, record, and play back at various points along the head as required. So here's a smaller mixing console, though still a large format mixing console. This is the 24-channel Trident 88 that we have in our Control Room D, that is 212B. A little bit smaller and more manageable, but also not as many features as the API Vision. But you get the idea. In this case, we record to Pro Tools through this console, but we effectively use Pro Tools in this case just as tape. I'm going to take a moment here and I'm going to switch over screens. So on the screen right now, I've brought up the mix view from an open Pro Tools session, and we can see something that looks very much like the paradigm that we were talking about with the mixer and the tape console. In this case, the mix view, as the name implies, is our mixer. We see the various faders here, and in Pro Tools, we have spaces that we can do what we call inserts. We also have spaces that we can do aux sends, and we can create aux returns. In other words, mix view effectively becomes the mixer of the old recording studio paradigm. Here we have the edit view, which is sort of like the tape machine. So going right to left, we have the various tracks along our timeline, and we can see the various events, whether they're vocal tracks, more vocal tracks, a lot of vocal tracks in this mix. Some MIDI data mapped out here And this is utilizing the MIDI sequencing function. You'll recall from our previous video when we talked about the use of computers in music, we talked about MIDI sequencers and how that fit into the world of recording initially as hardware sequencers. They were eventually replaced by software sequencers, and eventually software sequencers were married with the digital audio workstations of the day. And so in this Pro Tools session, we see that I'm doing MIDI sequencing as well as audio. So we work our way up, we see a lot of guitar tracks, some bass tracks, and some drum tracks. So again, we want to think about this underlying paradigm. And the reason this kind of becomes important for us is, of course, in the early days of recording technology, as we were beginning to switch over to digital audio workstations, it was important for them to have some basic appeal to the audio engineers who were used to working with that large format console and tape machine interface. So we're going to find that most of the DAWs that we work at this semester, or work with this semester, utilize this underlying idea. Somewhere they're going to have something called a mix view, somewhere they're going to have something called an edit view, or a timeline that gives us a sense of the kind of events that we've recorded and where they are in the timeline. So now we're going to go ahead and switch over and look at another DAW. Here we're looking at Apple's Logic. This is a DAW that a lot of our students may choose to use for some of their assignments. Here, instead of seeing separate windows for the mix view and the edit view, we simply see them as panes within the one common window here. So we can see our mix view down on the bottom. We can see our edit view and our timeline here up above. And of course, we're able to sort of adjust the amount of screen we want to dedicate to each of those. Additionally, you can see that when we've selected tracks here, they're brought up in a bit of a focus view over here on the left-hand side of the screen. But the same basic material is there. Looks a little different, but the same underlying paradigm of an editing part of our screen where we deal with our audio that basically represents what would have been tape back in the day, and our mix view, where we handle signal routing and signal processing. So that gives us a basic introduction of what we're looking at in a digital audio workstation. Again, every DAW is going to be a little different, but the same underlying paradigm is common to almost all DAWs in the modern world. A view where we see something that represents our data, our audio information or MIDI information mapped out over a timeline where we're going to do editing. And another view that shows us a mixer where we're going to handle our signal routing and our signal processing, as well as the final mix, the final musical balance that we create by changing the levels of those different signals. So we're going to come back in more detail in a future video in which we're going to start getting into some of the ins and outs, literally the inputs and outputs of a digital audio workstation, as well as the signal flow through a digital audio workstation. But this should give you at least a bit of a background on how we end up working in digital audio workstations, and we'll be doing some in-class demos to give you some ideas of what you might be tasked with on your upcoming assignments. All right, we'll see you next time around.